the 17th of January 1942. Fort Knox, Kentucky. The frozen ground crunches beneath boots as American officers gather in the early morning darkness, their breath visible in the bitter cold. Inside a converted warehouse, illuminated by harsh overhead lights, sits a collection of machines that represent the sum total of American tank destroyer doctrine. A few modified half-tracks, outdated 37mm guns mounted on trucks, and a single prototype vehicle that looks more like a compromise than a weapon. Outside, beyond the fence line, the nation sleeps uneasily. Somewhere across two oceans, German Panzer divisions are carving through Soviet steppes with mechanical precision, and in the jungles of Southeast Asia, Japanese tanks roll virtually unopposed through collapsing colonial defenses. The officers standing in that cold Kentucky warehouse understand a terrible truth that most Americans do not yet grasp. Their country has entered a war for which it is catastrophically unprepared, and nowhere is that unpreparedness more acute than in the realm of tank warfare. The United States Army possesses no dedicated tank killer, no vehicle designed from the outset to hunt and destroy enemy armor, no doctrine proven in combat, no production lines ready to mass-produce salvation. What they have instead is an idea, a desperate timeline, and the hope that American industrial might can transform theory into steel before the lack of it transforms soldiers into casualties. The path to this moment of reckoning had been paved with decades of peacetime complacency and institutional blindness. Throughout the 1,930 seconds, while Germany refined the concept of combined arms mechanized warfare and forged the panzer divisions that would rewrite military strategy, the United States Army remained intellectually and materially trapped in the previous war. American military doctrine viewed tanks primarily as infantry support weapons, slow-moving pillboxes meant to accompany foot soldiers across no man's land in a replay of 1918. The concept of massed armor formations executing rapid, deep penetrations into enemy territory seemed foreign, almost fantastical, to officers whose careers had been shaped by the static warfare of the Western Front. Even as reports filtered back from Spain, where German and Soviet tanks clashed in the dress rehearsal for the coming conflagration, American planners remained unconvinced that tank versus tank combat would play a decisive role in future conflicts. The tank destroyer force that would eventually emerge from this institutional inertia did not exist on the 7th of December, 1941. Neither did a clear understanding of what such a force would need to succeed. The fall of France in June 1940 provided the first terrible lesson, though it took time for American observers to fully comprehend what they had witnessed. German Panzer divisions, spearheaded by Mark III and Mark IV tanks, supported by mobile anti-tank guns, had achieved in 6 weeks what the Kaiser's armies could not accomplish in 4 years. The speed of the collapse stunned military establishments worldwide. British and French forces, possessing tanks that were in many cases superior to their German counterparts in armor and armament, had been outmaneuvered, surrounded, and systematically destroyed not because their equipment was inferior, but because German doctrine, training, and operational concepts were revolutionary. The Germans understood combined arms warfare. They understood the importance of radio communication, of air-ground coordination, of concentrating armor at decisive points rather than dispersing it in support of infantry. And critically, they understood that tanks required specialized weapons to kill other tanks, weapons that could move quickly, strike from favorable positions, and disengage before enemy forces could respond. American military intelligence officers studying the French defeat recognized the implications, but recognition alone could not conjure into existence the weapons, vehicles, and trained crews that would be needed to implement similar concepts. The institutional response that emerged in late 1940 and early 1941 reflected both genuine insight and fundamental misunderstanding. A group of forward-thinking officers, including Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce, began advocating for a dedicated tank destroyer force organized around speed, firepower, and aggressive tactics. Their vision, crystallized in what would become known as tank destroyer doctrine, emphasized offensive action rather than defensive preparation. Tank destroyers would not be tied to infantry formations or dispersed across the front in static positions. Instead, they would operate as mobile reserve forces, concentrating rapidly at threatened points to meet enemy armor breakthroughs with massed firepower. The concept was theoretically sound, even elegant in its simplicity. It drew inspiration from both German tactical flexibility and the traditional American preference for offensive action. But it rested on an assumption that would prove tragically optimistic: that speed and tactical positioning could compensate for deficiencies in armor protection, and that American crews could be trained quickly enough to execute this demanding doctrine before being committed to combat. Neither assumption would survive contact with reality. The immediate problem facing the nascent tank destroyer force was the absence of any vehicle remotely suitable for the role. The American armored vehicle inventory in early 1942 consisted primarily of the M3 Stuart light tank, armed with a 37mm gun that was already obsolete against modern enemy armor, and the newly introduced M3 Lee medium tank, an awkward design featuring a 75mm gun mounted in a sponson that required the entire vehicle to be pointed at the target. Neither possessed the combination of mobility, firepower, and low profile that tank destroyer doctrine demanded. Various improvised solutions were attempted. The M3 half-track, a hybrid vehicle combining a truck front with tracked rear propulsion, was fitted with 75mm guns in makeshift mountings. These conversions, designated M3 gun motor carriages, represented desperation rather than design. They were top-heavy, inadequately armored, and possessed mediocre cross-country performance. Their crews would be exposed to small arms fire and artillery fragments. But they were available, and availability in early 1942 counted for more than excellence. Thousands were ordered into production, even as designers worked frantically on something better. That something better emerged from the drawing boards as the T-35 prototype in the spring of 1942. The design philosophy reflected the core principles of tank destroyer doctrine: maximum firepower and mobility with minimal armor protection. The T-35 used the chassis of the M4 Sherman tank, itself only just entering production, modified to accommodate a larger turret armed with a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun adapted for anti-tank use. The choice of the 3-inch gun represented both ambition and compromise. It could penetrate any German or Japanese tank then known to American intelligence at standard combat ranges. Its high-velocity armor-piercing rounds could defeat the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at 1,500 yards. But the gun had never been intended for use in a ground combat vehicle. Adapting it required solving numerous technical problems related to recoil management, ammunition storage, and crew ergonomics. The T-35's turret, necessarily larger than that of a standard Sherman to accommodate the weapon and its recoil mechanism, was left open-topped to save weight and allow faster crew escape if the vehicle was hit. This design choice would become one of the M10's most controversial features, praised by some for improving crew survivability and situational awareness, condemned by others for exposing crews to airbursts, grenades, and inclement weather. The prototype underwent accelerated testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland during the summer of 1942. Under normal circumstances, a new armored vehicle would spend months or even years in evaluation, with engineers identifying and correcting design flaws, testing reliability under various conditions, and refining manufacturing processes. The T-35 received weeks. Engineers knew the design was imperfect. The turret traverse mechanism was too slow. It took nearly 2 minutes to rotate the turret manually from one side to the other, an eternity in combat where seconds determined survival. The vehicle's silhouette, despite efforts to keep it low, was higher than desired, making concealment difficult. The open-topped turret, while beneficial in some respects, created obvious vulnerabilities. Maximum armor thickness on the hull front was just 2 inches, sloped for improved ballistic protection, but still inadequate against direct hits from German anti-tank weapons. But imperfect vehicles in the hands of American soldiers seemed preferable to perfect vehicles that would not exist for another year. On the 18th of June, 1942, the T-35 was standardized as the M10 tank destroyer and ordered into immediate mass production. The first production vehicles rolled off assembly lines in September, less than 4 months from prototype to deployment. It was an astonishing achievement of American industrial capacity. It was also a gamble that would be paid for in blood. The men who would crew the M10 entered training camps across the United States throughout late 1942 and early 1943, knowing only that they were joining something new, something urgently needed, something that the very survival of American forces overseas might depend upon. They came from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit, from small southern towns and crowded eastern cities. Many had never seen a tank before, let alone trained to destroy one. The Tank Destroyer School at Camp Hood, Texas, sprawling across hundreds of square miles of scrubland, became the crucible where civilians were transformed into tank hunters. The training was intense, compressed, and in many ways improvisational. Instructors, many of whom had been in uniform only slightly longer than their students, taught tactics that had never been tested in combat by American forces. They emphasized speed, aggression, and the element of surprise. Tank destroyers would not engage in slugging matches with enemy armor. They would ambush from concealment, fire until the enemy located them, then displace rapidly to new positions before retaliatory fire could arrive. Shoot and scoot. The doctrine sounded simple. Executing it while under fire, with enemy shells searching for your position and infantry attempting to flank your vehicle, would prove infinitely more complex. The M10 itself impressed the trainees who first encountered it, even as they discovered its limitations. It was faster than a Sherman tank, capable of reaching speeds over 30 miles per hour on roads, and its 3-inch gun commanded respect from anyone who witnessed the damage it could inflict on target hulks during gunnery practice. The open-topped turret, initially viewed with suspicion, came to be appreciated for the excellent visibility and ventilation it provided. Crews could communicate more easily with supporting infantry. The commander could observe the battlefield without being confined to a narrow periscope view, but the training could not fully replicate combat conditions. Target practice against stationary hulks at known ranges bore little resemblance to engaging moving enemy tanks that were simultaneously trying to kill you. Navigation exercises across the Texas scrubland did not prepare crews for advancing through mud-choked European roads under artillery bombardment, and no amount of training could overcome certain fundamental limitations built into the vehicle itself. The slow turret traverse meant that if an enemy tank appeared suddenly on your flank, precious seconds would elapse before you could bring your gun to bare seconds, during which the enemy might fire first. The thin armor meant that any hit from a German anti-tank gun or tank cannon would likely penetrate, turning the crew compartment into a coffin of shattered steel and burning fuel. The first M10 battalions shipped overseas in the spring of 1943, bound for North Africa, where American forces were still learning the brutal lessons of mechanized warfare against the Afrika Korps. The veterans of Kasserine Pass, where German Panzers had mauled American units in February 1943, understood what the M10 crews had yet to experience, that combat against competent, well-equipped enemy forces bore no resemblance to training exercises. The arrival of the M10S was welcomed, but experienced officers recognized that the vehicles were being introduced into service under less than ideal circumstances. The crews were green, with no combat experience and minimal time to work together as cohesive units. The doctrine was unproven. And the enemy they would face, while diminished by years of desert fighting and increasingly precarious logistics, remained professionally competent and equipped with tanks and anti-tank guns that could destroy an M10 as easily as an M10 could destroy them. The American tank destroyer crews were about to discover what German panzer crews and Soviet tank battalions and British armor regiments had learned before them. That armored warfare was not glorious, that speed and firepower meant nothing if you were hit first, and that the margin between survival and obliteration was measured in fractions of seconds and inches of armor plate. The M10's combat debut in Tunisia during the final phase of the North African campaign provided the first real-world test of American tank destroyer doctrine. The results were mixed, instructive, and occasionally harrowing. In defensive positions, with good fields of fire and prepared concealment, M10s proved devastatingly effective. German Mark III and Mark IV tanks, attempting to break through American lines, were engaged at long range by the 3-inch guns and knocked out with shots that punched through their frontal armor. The M10's powerful main gun and the training emphasis on accurate long-range gunnery paid dividends in these engagements. But when M10 battalions attempted the aggressive, mobile operations that doctrine demanded, rushing forward to meet enemy breakthroughs, displacing rapidly between firing positions, they encountered problems that no amount of training could have fully anticipated. The vehicles proved mechanically temperamental under the harsh conditions of desert warfare. Dust infiltrated engines and transmissions. The open-topped turret, beneficial in temperate climates, became a liability under the North African sun, where crews baked in metal ovens and struggled to remain alert during long hours of observation. And when M10s encountered German anti-tank guns rather than tanks, the equation changed dramatically. A well-camouflaged 88mm anti-tank gun, crewed by experienced German gunners, could destroy an M10 from ranges at which the American vehicle could barely see the enemy position, let alone return effective fire. The thin armor that had been accepted as a trade-off for mobility proved to be a death sentence when facing weapons designed to destroy much heavier vehicles. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and the subsequent Italian campaign introduced M10 crews to new challenges that had received little emphasis during training. Tank versus tank combat, the scenario that tank destroyer doctrine was built around, proved to be relatively rare in the mountainous Italian terrain. Instead, M10s found themselves employed in infantry support roles, engaging fortified positions, providing covering fire during river crossings, and destroying buildings where German infantry had established strongpoints. This was precisely the kind of mission that tank destroyer doctrine had rejected: static, defensive, tied to the pace of infantry advance rather than executing rapid, independent maneuvers. But military necessity trumped doctrinal purity. The M10's 3-inch gun was highly effective against fortifications and buildings. Its relative mobility allowed it to navigate mountain roads that would have stalled heavier vehicles. Crews adapted to roles they had not been trained for, learning through experience how to support infantry attacks, how to provide indirect fire against targets they could not directly observe, how to survive in an environment where German artillery observers on mountain peaks could call down accurate fire on any vehicle that exposed itself for more than a few moments. The M10 was not the weapon its designers had envisioned, but it was the weapon the army had, and soldiers made it work because the alternative was unacceptable. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, M10 battalions had accumulated 2 years of combat experience, and the vehicle itself had evolved through numerous field modifications and lessons learned. Crews had developed techniques for improving the M10's survivability and effectiveness. The open-topped turret, impossible to armor without fundamentally redesigning the vehicle, was often covered with improvised canvas or metal screens to protect against hand grenades and overhead shell fragments. Additional sandbags or spare track links were welded to hull fronts and sides in attempts to improve protection against anti-tank rounds, though these modifications added weight that strained suspensions and reduced mobility. Camouflage and concealment techniques had been refined to an art form. Experienced M10 commanders understood that their vehicle's best protection was not being seen at all, and they positioned their tank destroyers with meticulous attention to sight lines, cover, and escape routes. The doctrine of aggressive, mobile warfare had been tempered by the reality that advancing across open ground toward enemy positions was frequently suicidal. Tank destroyers learned to fight more like ambush predators than cavalry, selecting positions that maximized their long-range firepower advantage while minimizing exposure to enemy return fire. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy tested M10 crews in ways that no previous campaign had. The Bocage country, with its ancient earthen banks topped with thick vegetation that divided the landscape into countless small enclosures, negated many of the M10's advantages. Long-range gunnery meant nothing when visibility was measured in yards rather than hundreds of meters. Mobility was useless when every field was a potential killing ground, and every hedgerow might conceal a German anti-tank gun or Panzerfaust armed infantry. The slow turret traverse, a manageable limitation in open terrain, became potentially fatal in close quarters, where enemy tanks or assault guns could appear suddenly from behind adjacent hedgerows. M10 crews fought with a constant awareness that their thin armor would not protect them if they were ambushed at close range. They learned to work in close coordination with infantry, who could scout ahead and identify enemy positions before the tank destroyers committed themselves to advancing. They learned to respect the Panzerfaust, the German shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon that could penetrate the M10's armor at ranges up to 100 yards, turning every German soldier into a potential tank killer. And they learned that courage and training and tactical skill sometimes were not enough, that randomness and bad luck could kill you as easily as enemy action, and that the thin line between survival and death often came down to factors beyond any crew's control. Yet even as M10 crews fought and died in the Norman hedgerows, the vehicle they crewed was already obsolescent. German tank development had not been static, while the M10 moved from drawing board to production to deployment. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943, mounted a long 75mm gun that could penetrate the M10's armor at virtually any range, and possessed frontal armor thick enough to be largely immune to the M10's 3-inch gun, except at point-blank ranges, or when struck on the sides or rear. The Tiger tank, though less numerous, was even more formidable. Its 88mm gun could destroy an M10 from distances at which the American vehicle had no hope of penetrating the Tiger's heavy frontal armor. American tank destroyer crews learned through bitter experience to avoid frontal engagements with these heavy German tanks whenever possible. Shooting at a Tiger from the front was not combat, it was suicide. The only hope was maneuver, to use the M10's superior mobility to flank the German heavy tanks and engage their more vulnerable side and rear armor, or to ambush them from concealment and disable them with first-shot hits on tracks or turret rings. These tactics worked, sometimes, but they required a level of tactical sophistication, crew coordination, and sheer luck that could not be guaranteed in the chaos of combat. Many M10 crews never got the opportunity to execute the perfect flank attack or the well-planned ambush. They encountered enemy armor unexpectedly, at close range, in situations where the only choice was to fight or die. And the outcome of such encounters was largely predetermined by the respective capabilities of the vehicles involved. The broader strategic situation by late 1944 had also evolved in ways that further complicated the M10's role. The Allied advance across France and into Germany increasingly became a war of logistics as much as combat. Fuel shortages repeatedly halted armoured spearheads. Ammunition supply struggled to keep pace with consumption. Replacement vehicles and crews had to be transported from ports hundreds of miles behind the front lines. In this environment, the M10's mechanical reliability, never its strongest characteristic, became a significant liability. Broken transmissions, worn-out engines, and damaged suspensions sidelined vehicles that might have been crucial in upcoming engagements. Maintenance crews worked desperately to keep M10 battalions operational, cannibalizing damaged vehicles for spare parts, improvising repairs with whatever materials were available, and performing maintenance under conditions that ranged from difficult to impossible. The M10 crews themselves had evolved significantly from the green recruits who had shipped overseas in 1943. They were veterans now, hard and competent, survivors of campaigns that had killed many of their comrades, and replaced their initial enthusiasm with a grim professionalism focused entirely on survival and mission accomplishment. They knew their vehicle's strengths and limitations intimately. They had learned what worked and what got you killed. and they understood, though few spoke it aloud, that they were fighting in machines that were increasingly outmatched by the enemy weapons they faced. The German Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the desperate gamble that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, threw M10 battalions into the kind of mobile, defensive combat that tank destroyer doctrine had originally envisioned. As German panzer divisions poured through the initial breakthrough points in the American lines, M10 units rushed to blocking positions along key roads and crossroads, attempting to delay the enemy advance and buy time for American forces to organize coherent defensive lines. This was the scenario that planners in 1942 had imagined: enemy armor breakthrough, American tank destroyers concentrating rapidly to meet the threat, aggressive engagement to blunt the attack. The reality proved both more chaotic and more costly than doctrine had anticipated. M10s engaged German tanks and assault guns in confused fighting along snow-covered roads, often at ranges where the enemy's superior armor protection gave them decisive advantages. American crews fought with desperate courage, knowing that their positions were all that stood between German spearheads and critical supply depots or communication centers. They knocked out Panthers and Panzer IVs, but they paid a terrible price. M10s were destroyed in numbers that shocked commanders. Some battalions lost half their vehicles in the first days of the offensive. Crews who survived the destruction of their vehicles were immediately assigned to replacement M10s and sent back into combat. The mechanical tempo of the fighting allowed no time for rest, for processing trauma, for anything except loading ammunition and searching for the next enemy silhouette through the gun sight. Yet somehow, alongside the British-designed M10 Wolverine variant that the British Army had adopted and upgunned with their excellent 17-pounder anti-tank gun, and alongside the towed anti-tank guns and tank battalions and infantry with their shoulder-fired bazookas, the M10 crews held. The German advance, though initially spectacular, began to slow as it encountered determined American resistance at key points. Fuel shortages, always the Wehrmacht's Achilles heel, began to bite. Allied air power, grounded during the initial days of the offensive by bad weather, returned to pound German supply columns. And at countless road junctions and defensive positions whose names would never be remembered, M10 crews engaged enemy armor and refused to withdraw until their positions became untenable or their vehicles were reduced to burning hulks. The Bulge was eventually defeated by the combined efforts of the entire Allied force in the theatre, but the M10 battalions that fought there earned their place in the victory through a campaign that validated some elements of tank destroyer doctrine while exposing the fatal flaws in others. Speed and mobility mattered, but not as much as adequate armor protection. Aggressive tactics worked, but only when the enemy's capabilities and dispositions were properly understood, and firepower alone could not overcome the fundamental mismatch when American vehicles designed in 1942 faced German armor developed specifically to defeat them. The final months of the European War saw M10 battalions continuing to fight, though increasingly supplemented and eventually replaced by the M36 tank destroyer, which mounted a 90mm gun capable of dealing with German heavy armor on more equal terms. The M10s that remained in service were often relegated to secondary roles, supporting second-line units or employed in infantry support missions where their gun remained effective, even if their armor protection was inadequate for front-line tank combat. Crews who had fought in M10s since North Africa or Italy found themselves training on the new M36s, transferring their hard-won experience to slightly better vehicles while reflecting on the friends and comrades who had not survived long enough to benefit from improved equipment. The casualty rates among tank destroyer battalions throughout the European campaign were staggering. Exact figures vary depending on methodology, but some M10 battalions experienced casualty rates exceeding 50% over the course of the war. These losses reflected not only the inherent dangers of armoured combat, but also the fundamental vulnerability of a vehicle that sacrificed protection for mobility and firepower. Many of the men who died in M10s were killed by weapons that could not have penetrated a more heavily armoured vehicle, or in situations where a faster turret traverse might have allowed them to fire first, or when better mechanical reliability might have prevented their vehicle from being immobilized and destroyed. In the Pacific Theater, where M10s saw more limited service, the vehicle's capabilities proved more closely matched to the threat. Japanese tanks were lighter and less well-armed than their German counterparts, and the M10's 3-inch gun was devastating against them in the rare instances when Japanese armor was encountered. More commonly, M10s were used to reduce fortifications and bunkers, missions for which their powerful gun and reasonable mobility made them well-suited, despite not being their intended purpose. Pacific M10 crews faced different challenges than their European counterparts. Jungle terrain that limited mobility, oppressive heat and humidity that made the open-topped turret a mixed blessing, and an enemy that emphasized infantry anti-tank tactics over massed armor. Yet the fundamental experience was similar soldiers making do with imperfect tools, adapting doctrine to reality, and surviving through a combination of skill, teamwork, and fortune. The symbolic weight of the M10, examined from the perspective of 7 decades of hindsight, rests uneasily on the gap between aspiration and achievement. The vehicle represented America's attempt to rapidly field a weapon system for which it had no experience, no established doctrine, and no time for the methodical development that produces truly excellent equipment. It was a rushed compromise born of desperate necessity, designed by engineers who were learning as they worked, and built by an industrial base that was only beginning to shift from peacetime production to wartime mobilization. That it worked at all was testament to American ingenuity and the adaptability of the soldiers who crewed it. That it worked imperfectly, that it cost lives that a better vehicle might have saved, was the inevitable consequence of entering a modern mechanized war without adequate preparation. The M10 was not the tank destroyer that American forces needed in 1942, but it was the tank destroyer they could have in 1942, and that distinction made all the difference between having something and having nothing. The crews who fought in M10s carried with them a knowledge that many of their fellow soldiers never fully grasped. They understood, because their survival depended on understanding, that American technological and industrial superiority was not absolute, that German engineering had produced tanks and anti-tank weapons that were in many respects superior to American equivalents, and that Allied victory would come not from having better individual weapons, but from having sufficient quantities of adequate weapons, supported by overwhelming logistics, air superiority, and the courage of soldiers who fought with what they were given rather than what they wished they had. This was a different kind of abundance than the material plenty that characterized the American home front. It was the abundance of industrial capacity that could lose 100 M10s and build 150 to replace them, that could absorb horrific casualty rates and continue to feed new crews into the meat grinder, that could outlast an enemy whose superior tactical excellence could not compensate for strategic exhaustion. The M10 crews were both beneficiaries and victims of this dynamic. They benefited from serving in an army that could replace losses. They were victims because they were sometimes the losses that needed to be replaced. The experience of fighting in an M10 changed the men who survived it in ways both obvious and subtle. The obvious changes were the visible ones, the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much death, the instinctive flinching at sudden noises even years after the war, the difficulty readjusting to civilian life, where people worried about trivialities and could not understand why the veterans sometimes seemed distant or angry or unwilling to talk about what they had experienced. The subtle changes ran deeper. They had learned that life was contingent, that chance could kill you as easily as enemy action, that bravery and skill improved your odds but guaranteed nothing. They had learned that they were capable of things they would never have imagined themselves doing, killing other human beings, watching friends die and continuing to function, enduring fear that threatened to paralyze them, and acting despite it. And they had learned something about their country that was simultaneously comforting and disturbing, that America would send its young men into combat in inadequate equipment if necessary, but that it would also move heaven and earth to eventually provide them with what they needed, even if that provision came too late for some. This knowledge, that they were valued but also expendable, cherished but also expendable, would shape the veterans' relationship with their nation for the rest of their lives. The M10 itself largely disappeared from American service soon after the war ended. A few were retained for training purposes, some were exported to Allied nations or sold as surplus. Most were scrapped, their steel recycled for peacetime purposes, their existence remembered primarily in official histories and the fading memories of aging veterans. The vehicle had served its purpose, however imperfectly, and in the rapid demobilization that followed victory, it became simply another piece of obsolete military equipment. The tank destroyer doctrine that the M10 had been designed to execute was similarly discarded. Post-war analysis concluded that the entire concept of specialized tank destroyer battalions separate from armored and infantry divisions was flawed, that the aggressive, mobile tactics tank destroyer doctrine demanded were impractical under actual combat conditions, and that future anti-tank capabilities should be integrated into combined arms formations rather than concentrated in independent units. This doctrinal reversal was the ultimate judgment on the M10 and the force built around it, that the idea, however appealing in theory, had not survived the test of combat. Yet this judgment was perhaps too harsh. The M10 had fought in every major American campaign in Europe and had contributed to victory, even if it had not revolutionized armored warfare, as its advocates had hoped. That contribution deserved recognition even as the mistakes that led to its creation deserved honest assessment. The question that haunts the M10's history is whether the vehicle needed to be so flawed, whether earlier recognition of the mechanized warfare revolution unfolding in Europe might have produced better American tank destroyers ready for deployment in 1942, whether different design choices could have produced a vehicle that sacrificed less crew protection in pursuit of mobility and firepower. These questions have no satisfying answers because they require imagining alternative histories where American military leadership in the 1,930 seconds possessed foreknowledge they could not have had, where budgets that barely funded a peacetime army somehow supported advanced tank development, where institutional cultures that resisted change suddenly embraced it. The M10 was the product of its time and circumstances. That it was inadequate to the challenges its crews faced was undeniable. That anything significantly better could have been produced under the constraints of 1,942 remains doubtful. American tank destroyer development would eventually produce the excellent M36, with its 90mm gun capable of defeating any German tank. But the M36 did not enter service until late 1944, far too late for the crews who fought and died in M10S during the intervening years. The progression from M3 half-tracks to M10S to M36S traced the arc of American learning, each generation incorporating lessons from the previous one, each improvement purchased with the blood of soldiers who fought in equipment that was good enough to win battles, but not good enough to guarantee their survival. The legacy of the M10 extends beyond the specific vehicle to the broader question of how democracies prepare for war. The United States in 1942 faced an enemy that had been preparing for mechanized warfare for a decade, that had tested its doctrines in Spain and Poland and France, that had integrated the lessons of each campaign into improved tactics and equipment. America had to condense that learning curve into months, fielding weapons and vehicles designed almost as they were being built, training crews who deployed overseas with minimal experience, and discovering through combat what Germany had learned through years of preparation. That American forces ultimately prevailed despite this disadvantage speaks to advantages that transcended individual weapon systems. Industrial capacity that could overwhelm enemy material superiority through sheer production volume, logistical capabilities that kept forces supplied across oceanic distances, air superiority that blinded enemy movements while exposing them to constant attack, and soldiers who proved adaptable and resilient despite fighting with imperfect equipment. The M10 represented all of this simultaneously: American unpreparedness, American industrial responsiveness, American pragmatism that valued available adequacy over theoretical perfection, and American willingness to send soldiers into harm's way with whatever tools could be provided, rather than waiting for ideal conditions that might never arrive. For the men who crewed M10s, the vehicle became a symbol of their entire war experience: rushed, imperfect, dangerous, but ultimately successful. They had fought in machines that were obsolescent before they entered combat, that offered inadequate protection, that possessed frustrating limitations they learned to work around through skill and experience. They had watched friends die in explosions that better armor might have prevented, had survived encounters that should have killed them through luck as much as ability, had adapted to roles their vehicle was never intended to perform, because military necessity demanded flexibility. And they had won. Not easily, not without terrible cost, not through the elegant execution of doctrine that proved unworkable in practice, but through persistence and courage and the cumulative weight of an industrial democracy fully mobilized for war. The M10's combat record was not the clean narrative of technological superiority defeating inferior enemies. It was the messy reality of adequate equipment in the hands of determined soldiers, proving sufficient to accomplish missions that often should have been impossible. This was perhaps the most American aspect of the M10's story, that it succeeded not through excellence but through stubborn refusal to fail, through making do with what was available, through adaptation and improvisation and sheer determination to overcome obstacles that doctrine and design had not anticipated. The passage of decades has transformed the M10 from a piece of military equipment to a historical artifact, preserved in museums where visitors can observe its thin armor and open-topped turret and wonder how anyone survived combat in such a vehicle. The statistics of its production, over 6,000 built, and its service record, fighting in North Africa, Italy, France, Germany, and the Pacific, hint at the scale of the story, but cannot capture the human dimension. Each M10 represented 5 crew members whose lives depended on the vehicle's capabilities and their own skills. Across all the M10 battalions that fought in World War II, thousands of soldiers experienced the particular terror of armored combat in a vehicle they knew was inadequately protected. The concentration required to identify and engage enemy tanks before being engaged themselves. The exhaustion of living in a cramped metal box that offered only the illusion of safety. Some of those soldiers survived the war and returned home to build families and careers, carrying memories they rarely discussed. Others died in the vehicles, killed by enemy fire or mechanical failures or sheer misfortune, and exist now only in casualty lists and cemetery registries and the fading recollections of ever fewer living veterans who remember their names and faces. The M10 stands in American military history as a monument to the improvisational phase of World War II, that period from 1942 to early 1944, when the United States was fully committed to global war, but not yet equipped with the weapons and vehicles that would eventually establish clear material superiority over its enemies. It was the era of making do, of fighting with what could be rapidly produced rather than what should ideally have been produced, of doctrines developed in training camps rather than validated through experience, of crews learning in combat lessons that peacetime armies learn through years of exercises and theoretical study. The M10 embodied all the virtues and flaws of this period. It demonstrated that American industry could respond with remarkable speed to urgent military requirements, turning concepts into production vehicles in months rather than years. It proved that aggressive doctrine could sometimes compensate for equipment deficiencies, that mobility and firepower could achieve results even when protection was sacrificed. But it also revealed the costs of unpreparedness, the casualties that resulted from sending soldiers into combat in vehicles that their enemies' weapons could easily destroy, the limitations of doctrine developed in isolation from combat experience. The M10 was both a success and a failure, and understanding its history requires holding both judgments simultaneously without allowing either to erase the other. In the final accounting, the M10 tank destroyer succeeded in its most essential mission. It gave American forces in 1942 and 1943 a dedicated tank-killing capability when they desperately needed one before better alternatives became available. That this capability came with significant limitations and costs does not negate its importance. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with M10s contributed to Allied victory in North Africa, delayed German counterattacks in Italy, supported the breakout from Normandy, and helped contain the Ardennes offensive. The vehicle was never what its designers hoped it would be, never the revolutionary weapon that tank destroyer doctrine envisioned. But it was present at critical moments, when having something that could destroy enemy tanks made the difference between success and failure in local engagements that collectively determined the outcome of campaigns. This presence, this availability at the moment of need, was the M10's true achievement. Not excellence, but sufficiency. Not perfection, but adequacy. Not the ideal weapon, but a weapon that could be fielded in time to matter. The 3-inch gun, mounted in its 2 slowly traversing turret, could punch through enemy armor at distances where American tankers could feel something approximating parity with their opponents. That feeling mattered psychologically, even when tactical reality was more complex. The crews knew they had a weapon that demanded respect from the enemy, that a well-placed shot could destroy any tank in the German or Japanese arsenal, even if achieving that well-placed shot required skill and favorable circumstances. This knowledge was a form of abundance, perhaps the most important kind in combat, the abundance of capability, of having tools adequate to the mission, of not being completely outmatched by the enemy. That the M10 provided this abundance only imperfectly, that it extracted a terrible price from its crews, that it was obsolescent almost from the moment it entered service, does not diminish the fact that it provided something crucial when nothing else was available. In the desperate years of 1942 and 1943, when American forces were learning how to fight a modern mechanized war through bitter experience, the M10 was what stood between raw recruits and veteran enemy tankers, between tactical setbacks and operational disasters, between having a chance and having none. For this, whatever its flaws, it deserves to be remembered not with condemnation, but with the complex respect we owe to imperfect tools that served in desperate times, wielded by soldiers who made them work through courage and skill that transcended the limitations of steel and doctrine.